Hello class. This video extends our discussion of clarity and fluency from last week and focuses primarily on mixed constructions and misplaced modifiers. So in terms of objectives and outcomes, there'll be a little bit of back and forth. We'll be revising some tangled sentences, particularly tangled in terms of its verb tense and points of view. And we're going to look at indirect and direct quotations and how to revise misplaced modifiers. Starting first with point of view. What is point of view? Well, at the level of writing, it refers to how we use pronouns like I, we, or they in our writing to essentially define a relationship between the subjects of the sentence and basically the subject matter that is being discussed. More specifically, when we talk about ourselves or our opinions and the things that happen to us, we generally speak in the first person. The biggest clue that a sentence is written in the first person is the use of first person pronouns. So we basically use pronouns like I, we, us, our, ourselves, and all those sort of first person pronouns to define that it's really I and we that is the perspective that we are writing from. Second person point of view belongs to the person or people being addressed. This is also referred to as the you perspective. So the biggest indicator of the second person is the use of second person pronouns such as you, your, yours, yourself, and yourselves. You typically see this second person more in business writing than you do in academic writing, but it's still something to be aware of. The third person point of view belongs to the person or people being talked about. So third person pronouns include he, him, his, himself, she, her, hers, herself, it, its, they, them, their, theirs, and themselves, and etc. And this is basically the kind of point of view that kind of takes a bird's eye view of what's being discussed and tends to sound the most objective. Now, sometimes when we're writing, we tend to mix these points of view unwillingly. And so we'll take the first person and mix it with the third, or the second and the third, and etc. And when we do this, sometimes it can be very confusing for our readers. And so we have to sort of decide first on what perspective basically is best for the kind of writing that we are doing and expressing, and making sure that we keep that as consistent as possible in our writing. So let's take a look at a few examples. And as before, we're going to think about first highlighting a problem spot before repairing the sentence. So consider the following. Frederick Douglass was born in slavery, but he was lucky because his owner's wife did not know that it was illegal for you to teach a slave to read and write. Now, what would be the problem spot here? If you guess that there is a shift between the third person and the second person, you're right. The beginning of the sentence basically takes that objective point of view describing a situation with the proper nouns and with the third person pronouns, he, they, right? But then it shifts to the second person, the you, and it becomes confusing because the writer then sounds like they're speaking directly to the reader as if it's something they had done. And so to revise this, we would change that you to her in order to clarify that we are speaking about the owner's wife and keeping that consistent third person perspective. Let's look at a few more examples. When online dating first became available, many people thought that it would simplify romance. We believed that you could type a list of criteria, a sense of humor, college education, green eyes, good job, and a database would select the perfect mate. Now, where again do we notice a shift? Well, there's quite a few of them here. We actually see a shift across all three tenses. Sometimes we seem to be describing the situation in the third person. Sometimes we describe it in the first person with the we here. Sometimes we describe it in the second person with the you, and so on. And so to revise this sentence, what we would have to do is we'd have to revise these pronouns so that everything is in the same point of view. One way we might accomplish this is to change all instances of the first and second person to the third. So we replace that we and that you with third person pronouns like hopeful singles and they. Let's look at another example. Thousands of people signed up for the services and filled out their profiles, convinced that true love was only a few mouse clicks away. As it turns out, however, virtual dating is no easier than traditional dating. I still have to contact the people I find, exchange emails and phone calls, and meet him in the real world. Now, what are the problem spots here? If you guessed that there was a shift from the third person to the first person, you're right. So how might we revise this I, him construction to sound like it is in the third person point of view, like the first half of the paragraph? Well, we could replace that I with users and with they. So that way we are referring to everyone in the third person, and again taking that more objective point of view. Now another type of mixed construction is how we might misuse or mispunctuate direct quotes. So for the purposes of this part of the lesson, let's make sure to clearly define the distinction between what's a direct quote and an indirect quote. A direct quotation is when you are directly quoting what someone has said, word for word, not paraphrasing. You put direct quotations and quotation marks around that sentence that you are borrowing. An indirect quotation is when you're reporting what someone has said, but not exactly. You're paraphrasing. You're putting things in your own words, and you don't need any kind of quotation marks, or in the case of asking questions, you wouldn't need a question mark. So how might this get mixed up? Well, let's look at the example here. When a friend suggested Douglas as a last name, Frederick asked whether it was a satisfactory name and did it fit well with Frederick. Now, what might be the problem spots with this sentence? If you guess that there's a mix between the way it is punctuated and basically the way that we have this noun verb phrase that leads into either a direct or an indirect quotation, you're right. So right now it's not clear whether or not there is a paraphrase that is happening or if it is a direct quotation. So we would have to revise it to more accurately fit one or the other. So we could make this a direct quotation by adding quotation marks. When a friend suggested Douglas as a last name, Frederick asked, does it fit well with Frederick? Or we could just simply revise the punctuation. When a friend suggested Douglas as a last name, Frederick asked whether it was a satisfactory name and did it fit well with Frederick, removing the quotation mark here and replacing it with a period. Now we're doing a paraphrase here, an indirect quotation, rather than a direct quote. To conclude this lesson, let's think about modifiers. Now, we learned last week that when we write in a plain academic style, we want to limit modifiers as much as possible. And that modifiers are essentially adjectives, adverbs, or any noun used attributively. They change the meaning of another word in some way. We also remember the examples that we discussed in class. So in chapter 13, when it talks about a dangling modifier, that's essentially times when we determine that if a modifier is still necessary for the sentence, then that modifier needs to be close enough to the word or phrase that is actually being modified. Any increase in distance between a modifier and then the word whose meaning it's supposed to change can become confusing for readers. So let's look at a few examples of this. Murrigan almost spent all of his time writing, using every waking moment to exposit his ideas. Between 1852 and 1862, Murrigan just wrote more than 300 articles for the New York Tribune. Murrigan wanted only one thing for himself: recognition of the importance of his ideas. Take a look at these for a moment. Try to identify which words are the modifier and what are the words or phrases that that modifier is supposed to be changing. Okay, let's see how you did. So in the first example, the modifier almost is modifying the phrase all of his time. And so if this sentence sounded strange to you, it's because that modifier is one word away, essentially, from that phrase that it's supposed to be modifying. In the second example, same problem. The modifier just is too far away from the phrase for the New York Tribune, basically the phrase that is being modified. And in the last example, very similarly, one word away. The word only here is supposed to modify the phrase one thing for himself. So what we would have to do in these instances is take those modifiers and put them much closer to the word or phrases that they are supposed to modify. Murrigan spent almost all of his time writing, using every waking moment to exposit his ideas. Between 1852 and 1862, Murrigan wrote more than 300 articles just for the New York Tribune. Murrigan wanted only one thing for himself: recognition of the importance of his ideas. So that concludes this lesson, an extension of untangling mixed constructions and correcting misplaced modifiers. Thank you very much for your work. I look forward to seeing you all.